In ancient Persia, a method of execution was devised so utterly horrific that its mere description was intended to serve as a powerful deterrent. It was known as Scaphism, or sometimes the boats. The condemned individual was meticulously trapped between two small vessels, typically hollowed-out tree trunks or boats, with only their head, hands, and feet left exposed. To accelerate their torment, they were force-fed a noxious mixture of milk and honey until they developed severe, uncontrollable diarrhea. More honey was then liberally smeared across their vulnerable exposed skin. The victim was subsequently abandoned in a stagnant pond, left defenseless under the relentless sun. The sickening combination of sweetness and the odor of decay proved irresistible to the local insect population. Over several agonizing days, swarms of flies, wasps, and other insects would infest the body, burrowing into the flesh. This infestation inevitably led to rampant infection and, ultimately, a slow, agonizing death from septic shock. Accounts from antiquity suggest that a soldier named Mithrates reportedly endured this torment for an astonishing 17 days. Historical records paint a grim picture of his remains discovered in an advanced state of decomposition, entirely consumed by the very insects that had fed upon him throughout his prolonged ordeal. The Brazen Bull. In ancient Sicily, the notoriously cruel tyrant Phalaris commissioned a brilliant but unfortunate inventor named Perillos to craft the ultimate instrument of capital punishment. The result was the Brazen Bull, an imposing, hollow sculpture cast from bronze, large enough to contain a human, and featuring a discreet door on its side. Once the condemned was sealed inside, a roaring fire was ignited beneath the bronze effigy. As the metal slowly heated, the victim trapped within would be gradually roasted alive. The bull's design incorporated an ingenious, albeit macabre, acoustic system. Internal pipes were engineered to transform the agonizing screams of the dying into sounds eerily resembling a bull's bellowing. Moreover, steam generated by the intense heat would escape through the bull's nostrils, creating the illusion that the metallic beast had come terrifyingly to life. Upon witnessing Perillos demonstrate his grim invention, Phalaris, in a perverse display of power, ordered the inventor himself to be locked inside to test its efficacy. Perillos was mercifully pulled out just before succumbing to death, only to be thrown from a cliff. Years later, a brutal irony befell Phalaris when he was overthrown. He met his own demise within the confines of the very device he had commissioned, the Blood Eagle. According to the ancient Norse sagas, the Blood Eagle was a ritualistic execution of unparalleled brutality, purportedly reserved for the most grievous enemies, specifically, those who had murdered family members. Described in medieval texts, the ritual commenced with the victim being placed face down. Their ribs were then meticulously severed from the spine, one by one. The ribs and attached skin were subsequently pulled outward, creating a grotesque resemblance to outstretched wings. Finally, the lungs were removed and placed upon the victim's back, a chilling final flourish. Viking Earl Thorfinar is famously alleged to have performed this ritual on Halfdan Longleg, a rival, dedicating the mangled body to the god Odin. Centuries later, Ivar the Boneless, a legendary Viking leader, reportedly exacted similar vengeance upon King Aella, avenging his father's death. However, modern scholars now largely suggest that the Blood Eagle may have been a literary exaggeration or a misunderstanding of poetic descriptions, rather than a historically factual practice. A comprehensive study conducted in 2022 further indicated that, even if attempted, a victim would have died within mere seconds from catastrophic blood loss, rendering the idea of prolonged torture, as popularly believed, physiologically impossible. Lingchi. While the Vikings may have approached such rituals with a degree of internal debate concerning morality, medieval China held no such reservations about the application of prolonged suffering. For nearly a millennium, China employed one of history's most protracted and agonizing execution methods, Lingchi, chillingly translated as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned individual was publicly tied to a wooden frame, their body exposed. Using a meticulously sharpened blade, the executioner would make systematic, deliberate cuts, often starting with the limbs and extremities, specifically avoiding vital organs to ensure a prolonged and excruciating death. This agonizing process could span hours, and in some documented cases, even days. Historical records indicate a wide range in the number of cuts administered, from approximately 100 during the Yuan dynasty to over 3,000 in the Ming dynasty. Wealthy families could, however, bribe the executioner to perform a swift throat cut at the outset, ensuring a quicker death and rendering the subsequent slicing purely symbolic. Lingchi was typically reserved for the gravest crimes, including high treason, patricide, and mass murder. The last recorded instance occurred in April 1905, merely weeks before China formally abolished the practice under considerable Western pressure. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. For over 6 centuries, England reserved its most brutal and humiliating punishment for the crime of high treason: hanged, drawn, and quartered. The condemned individual was first tied to a wooden panel and mercilessly dragged by a horse through public streets to the execution site, a process known as drawing. Upon reaching the gallows, they were hanged, but crucially, cut down before death, ensuring they remained conscious for the horrors to follow. What ensued was a systematic display of barbarity. The victim was disemboweled while still alive, their internal organs removed and ritualistically burned before their very eyes. Finally, they were beheaded, and their body was cut into 4 separate pieces. The severed head was then impaled and displayed prominently on London Bridge, while the other body parts were dispatched to various cities across the kingdom. This gruesome public spectacle served as an unequivocal warning. Challenging the monarch meant not only death, but utter public desecration. William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, famously suffered this fate in 1305. Guy Fawkes, sentenced for his role in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, famously avoided the worst of it by breaking his neck when he deliberately jumped from the gallows before the full procedure could commence. The practice was finally abolished in 1870. The breaking wheel. Across medieval Europe, the brutal method of breaking on the wheel was specifically reserved for heinous criminals such as murderers, highway robbers, and traitors. The condemned was tightly secured to a scaffold, their limbs cruelly stretched outward. Using a heavy iron bar, the executioner methodically shattered every major bone in the body, typically beginning with the legs and then moving to the arms. Sharp wooden blocks were often strategically placed beneath the joints to ensure complete and excruciating fractures. If the court deigned to show a modicum of mercy, a final, swift blow to the chest, a coup de grace, would grant a quick death. Without such mercy, the victim was left alive, a shattered, agonizing mess. Their broken body was then woven through the spokes of a large wooden wheel, which was subsequently hoisted atop a tall pole. There, exposed to the elements and the relentless scavenging of birds, the condemned would suffer a slow, agonizing death from shock, dehydration, and exposure, sometimes lingering for several days. The last recorded execution by will took place in Prussia in 1841. The sawing. However, systematic torture and execution methods were not limited to merely breaking bones. Some involved the literal division of the body. One of history's most methodical and terrifying execution methods was death by sawing. This brutal practice was employed across ancient Persia, Rome, Morocco, and various regions of Europe and Asia. The condemned was typically fastened securely between 2 wooden boards and then suspended upside down. This inversion was a deliberate cruelty, designed to maintain blood flow to the brain, thereby keeping the victim conscious for a far longer duration than would otherwise be possible. Using a large, 2-man saw, executioners would proceed to cut lengthwise through the body, typically starting from the lower abdomen and working upward. The process was painstakingly deliberate and agonizingly slow. In a chilling 1705 case from Morocco, the victim reportedly remained conscious even after being sawn up to the navel, famously asking for water before the executioners continued their gruesome work. Christian martyrs, including Simon the Zealot, are believed to have suffered this fate in ancient Persia. This method, in its horrifying efficacy, appeared across diverse cultures over many centuries. Flaying. Flaying, the barbaric act of removing the skin from a living person, was employed as both a method of torture and execution across ancient Assyria, medieval Europe, and China. Using sharp blades, executioners would systematically cut and peel away the victim's skin, often commencing from the extremities. Death was rarely swift. Victims typically succumbed hours or even days later, dying from the cumulative effects of shock, massive blood loss, hypothermia, or overwhelming infection. Neo-Assyrian kings were particularly notorious for this brutal practice. Rebellious leaders and captured enemies were flayed alive, their stripped skins then gruesomely displayed on city walls as a chilling warning to others. One of the most thoroughly documented medieval cases occurred in 1571. After surrendering Cyprus to Ottoman forces, the Venetian commander Marco Antonio Bragadin was flayed alive, head to toe. His skin was then stuffed with straw and paraded as a macabre trophy. Astonishingly, when his tomb was opened in 1961, his preserved skin was reportedly found inside, serving as a visceral confirmation of the historical account. The rat torture. Rat torture was ingeniously designed to maximize both physical agony and profound psychological terror. The most well-documented method of this particular horror emerged during the Dutch Revolt in the 1500s. The victim was restrained immovably on their back. A metal cage or a heavy pottery bowl, filled with starving, agitated rats, was then placed open-side down directly onto their bare abdomen. Hot coals were subsequently piled onto the top of the container. As the metal heated to an unbearable temperature, the trapped rats became frantic. With no upward escape, their only desperate recourse was downward. They would furiously claw and burrow through the victim's flesh in a desperate attempt to escape the escalating heat. This horrifying process could last for hours, with victims enduring not only the immense physical trauma of rats gnawing into their body, but also the unimaginable psychological horror of the ongoing invasion. Diederik Sonoy, a notorious ally of William the Silent, is documented as employing this method during the Dutch Revolt. The sheer terror induced by the technique was often enough to break a prisoner's will, frequently achieving its objective even before the rats began their horrific work. The elephant execution. For centuries across South and Southeast Asia, trained elephants, majestic yet terrifying, served as executioners for royalty, delivering public displays of raw power. These intelligent beasts were instructed by their handlers, known as mahouts, to kill in a variety of gruesome ways. They could crush a victim's head instantly with a single, massive step, systematically break limbs one by one, or use their powerful trunks to tear a body apart. Some elephants were even fitted with sharp blades attached to their tusks, allowing them to slice victims into pieces. The true horror of this method lay in the absolute control exerted by the ruler. At any moment, the monarch could order the elephant to halt, demonstrating a perverse mercy, or conversely, command a prolonged and agonizing torture. This chilling display served to affirm the ruler's absolute authority not only over their subjects, but also over the most formidable beasts of the wild. A documented execution in 1814 in Baroda involved an elephant dragging a victim a staggering 500 yards, dislocating every limb, before finally crushing his head. The practice eventually ceased in the mid-1800s as British colonial powers actively suppressed it. Electric chair botched executions. The electric chair was introduced in 1890, ironically hailed as a more humane and instantaneous alternative to hanging. It was designed to send a high-voltage electrical current through the condemned person's body, aiming to cause immediate death. However, due to recurring equipment failures and often tragic human error, many executions by electric chair have devolved into horrifying spectacles. In 1983, John Evans endured a torturous 14 minutes and 3 distinct jolts of electricity. During his ordeal, the electrode strapped to his leg burst into flames, and smoke visibly poured from his head. After the first jolt, doctors confirmed a heartbeat. The second jolt produced even more smoke, yet he remained alive. Only the third, prolonged jolt finally killed him, leaving his body severely charred. In 1990, Jesse Taffro's execution was similarly botched, producing 6-inch flames from his head and requiring 3 jolts, later attributed to the use of an incorrect type of sponge. Just 7 years later, in 1997, Pedro Medina suffered a comparable fate when foot-high flames erupted from his body, filling the execution chamber with acrid smoke. Despite these repeated, horrific failures, The electric chair shockingly remains a legal method of execution in several U.S. states. The lethal injection. Lethal injection was introduced in 1982, promoted as a supposedly humane alternative that would use a sequence of drugs to render the person unconscious, paralyze them, and then stop their heart. Instead, it has paradoxically garnered the highest failure rate of any modern execution method, recorded at 7.2%. The most notorious and widely publicized case occurred in Oklahoma on April 29, 2014. Clayton Lockett was declared unconscious approximately 10 minutes after receiving the first drug in the cocktail. However, a mere 3 minutes later, he began to struggle violently, raising his head and audibly saying, "Something's wrong." Officials swiftly closed the blinds, shielding the scene from witnesses. 20 agonizing minutes later, they were forced to halt the execution when it was discovered that the intravenous line had failed, causing the drugs to flow into muscle tissue rather than his vein. Lockett eventually died 43 minutes later from a massive heart attack. Witnesses present at the time unequivocally described the ordeal as torture. Despite these repeated and well-documented failures, lethal injection tragically remains America's primary method of capital punishment. The anti-aircraft gun. Under the regime of Kim Jong-un, North Korea employs one of the most extreme and terrifying modern execution methods, death by anti-aircraft gun. These formidable weapons, originally designed to destroy military aircraft and capable of firing hundreds of large-caliber rounds per minute, are repurposed for use at point-blank range on human beings. The condemned individual is typically tied to a post, with anti-aircraft guns positioned just 30 meters away. When fired, the body is instantly and utterly obliterated. This brutal method is specifically employed to target high-ranking officials accused of disloyalty. In 2015, Defense Minister Han Yong-chol was reportedly executed in this manner, with his own family forced to watch. A year later, in 2016, Ri Yong-jin was allegedly executed for the seemingly minor offense of falling asleep during a meeting with Kim Jong-un. These executions serve as a chilling form of state terror, designed to prevent defections and enforce absolute obedience, and the practice alarmingly continues to this day. From the ancient sands of Persia to the modern-day halls of America and North Korea, humanity has devoted millennia to inventing increasingly sophisticated, or perhaps just increasingly cruel, ways to end life. Each method, in its grim precision, reveals something profoundly dark and disturbing about the societies that employed them. While the specific techniques have certainly evolved, the underlying current of cruelty has, regrettably, remained constant. Today, capital punishment persists in over 50 countries worldwide. Some proponents argue that modern methods are now humane, even when mounting evidence and chilling testimonies suggest a far more agonizing reality.